On this episode, we cover the Joe Rogan Experience 24/27 with guest Bret Weinstein. Again, No Rogan Experience starts now. Welcome back to the show. This is a show where two podcasters, now with 156 hours of Rogan experience, get to know Joe Rogan. It's a show for those who are curious about Joe Rogan, his guests, and their claims, as well as for anyone who wants to understand Joe's ever-growing media influence. I'm Cecil Cicirello. That's Michael Marshall. And today, we're going to be covering Joe's December 17th interview with Bret Weinstein. So, Marsh, how did Joe introduce Bret in the show notes?
Bret Weinstein, PhD, is an evolutionary biologist, author, and co-host of the Dark Horse podcast with his wife, biologist Heather Haying. They are the co-authors of A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, Evolution and the Challenges of Modern Life.
Is there anything else we should know about?
Yeah, so obviously we've covered Bret Weinstein in the first series, so listeners will be familiar with who he is. He's an IDW, intellectual dark web figure. He made his name after he left a liberal arts college because he objected to an anti-racism protest, essentially. And then he subsequently mischaracterized that whole escapade and turned it into a career as an anti-woke, heterodox thinker, podcaster, and would-be public intellectual. That's kind of his vibe. And he was on Rogan. We covered him in the first series. He was actually on Rogan again in November of 2025, on November 8th. And I listened to that show. This is actually a really quick return. The show that we're doing is actually from December. So he was on twice in the space of about a month. And that's a really quick turnaround. And they addressed that in the interview because basically in November, he came on to talk about these new theories he has about evolution, but the conversation got completely sidetracked by Joe describing at length a dream that he'd had that morning. And then they never really got deep into what Bret was there to promote.
It's amazing.
And that's why he came back on this kind of month later in order to get back to his groundbreaking theories on evolution.
#1 podcast in the world.
Yeah, exactly. And it was like, here's a dream that I had last night about aliens. Genuinely, it was great.
What did they talk about, Marsh?
So they talked about Bret's new groundbreaking theory of evolution. And that kind of went through things like flying squirrels and telomeres and what's hidden in the code of our genes. And then they got into topics like universal basic income, sex, incels, what porn Bret's son's girlfriend's watching at the moment.
What?
Yeah. Bret's rules for life, his collab with Charlie Kirk, ivermectin. Obviously, this is Joe Rogan, data fraud, and also Sam Harris at length.
Okay, all right. Well, before we get to our main event, we want to thank our Area 51 All Access Pass patrons. That's normal names. Points for Marsh, What's the No Rogan Experience, Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast, Dr. Andrew Gibson, the online physics tutor, Chonky Cat in Chicago has claws out, Matthew Cutler, autistic Twitch streamer, Am I a Robot? Capture says no, but maintenance records say yes, 11 Gruthius, Don't Thank Me, Your Show is Just Worth Investment, Stone Banana, Laura Williams, no, not that one, the other one, Lucy Cortez, Angie Matke, Carissa Gunderson, Ramtam Tickler, Mike Fish, Fred Arguthius, Scott Laird, Darlene, Cindy Lynch, yes, that's Cindy Lynch, definitely an AI overlord, Stargazer 97, and Billionaire Oligarchs. They all subscribe to patreon.com/NoRogan. You can do that as well. All patrons will get a special patron-only bonus segment each week. And this week, this is where two big fears collide as Bret and Joe talk about sex robots. Bret fears the sex and Joe fears the robot. So check it out. Patreon.com/NoRogan. But for now, our main event.
It is time.
Hey, huge thank you to the veteran voice of the podcast. That was Jacob from Second Cut Pod on Substack, where they do movie reviews and essays. They were announcing our main event. Remember, you can do that too. You can be on the show just by sending us a recording of you giving us your best rendition of It's Time. You can send that to noroganpod@gmail.com. That's KNOW, noroganpod, as well as how you would like to be credited on the show. So we're going to start out the show, Marsh. You said that they did a bunch on evolution, and that's what our main event is this time. We're going to be talking about his ideas around evolution. This was something that they had to throw a whole podcast together. And so this is the very beginning of the show. This is Joe welcoming him back.
What's happening, man?
Hey, good to be back.
Good to see you. So the reason why we had such a quick turnaround is because the last episode, one of the main reasons why you wanted to come on in the first place is you wanted to further discuss some discoveries about evolution.
Yes, specifically, I have alluded in a number of different places, including here, to there being another level to Darwinian evolution that does a lot of the heavy lifting that we require in order to explain the diversity of forms that we see in biology. But I haven't been specific on what I believe that layer is. And I felt like it was time.
Okay, Bret, the reason you had such a quick turnaround is that there's basically 10 rotating guests on every other show.
Yeah, and Derek from More Plates, More Dates was presumably busy that week because it wasn't Thanksgiving. Also, yeah, I love that he says I felt it was basically time. It was time to say this. I mean, technically, time to say this was in November, but Joe was too busy having a dream.
Yeah, and look. He comes on and he says these are discoveries. That feels grander than what is happening here, right? When he says the word discoveries, it makes it seem like he's talking about something really that has been tested or has been sent out to his peers of some kind. This is not something that was created as an academic paper. This is, which is what would normally happen, right? What would normally happen is if you're a researcher or a scientist or, an academic, you would write an academic paper, you would hand it off to your peers, you would get feedback, and then you would mishmash your thoughts and your theory, and you would maybe change it or whatever, however that would work. You'd change it, you would throw it out, you would maybe, adjust it in some way. Maybe it's perfect, maybe they love it, however that works. But instead, what he does is he goes back to a podcast with a guy who doesn't really know what he's going to say or really understand it as deeply as Bret will, and he doesn't get the proper feedback or the proper critique from actual people in his field.
Yeah, that's a great point, because if you do have something genuinely groundbreaking, and what he's talking about, as we'll see, is something that he thinks explains what Darwin got wrong about evolution, what the gap is in evolution. If you genuinely had something that was remarkable in that kind of way, that was going to overturn something as fundamental and foundational as evolution, the way that you strengthen that theory isn't by talking to Joe Rogan about it. You don't strengthen it by talking to people who know less about this. You strengthen it by talking to people who know an awful lot about the conventional theories, and they will help you sort of panel beat out all the lumps and bumps that are left in your theory. This isn't how science is done, and we'll see the weaknesses of that throughout this interview.
All right, so the next bit is talking about the dogma around evolution.
So we say the way evolution works is random changes happen to the DNA because DNA is imperfectly copied or is impacted by radiation, which will eliminate a letter in the DNA. And then that letter will get replaced by a different letter. There are only 4 choices, but some fraction of the time you get a 3-letter combination that specifies a new amino acid. Almost all of the time, that will make the little molecular machine worse or break it altogether. Occasionally, it will leave the machine functional in a way that's somewhat better than the previous one. And then evolution will collect all of those advances. And that's how evolution works. That's the story we typically tell. And in fact, that's the story that is encoded in what's called the central dogma of molecular biology. Now, the problem, most people will have thought about that, and they will have heard, okay, random mutations that change this code in ways that alter proteins that sounds like a very haphazard process and a very difficult way to get from one form of animal or plant or fungus to another. So if you've had that thought, that just doesn't seem powerful enough. And then biologists have said, well, you're not realizing how much time elapses that allows these very occasional positive changes to accumulate. And that's true. If that's a thought you've had, this process isn't powerful enough to explain the creatures I'm aware of, then what I'm going to tell you is a way in which that process is not the only process. And by adding a different process, very much a Darwinian one, we can see that the power to create all of the creatures that we see is much greater than the story that we've been told.
Okay, so this is his framing of it here. And notice that he first explains what we know, what most people think of as kind of the way that mutation works in evolution. And his explanation isn't that bad. What he's talking about in terms of the letters that get changed in DNA, they get mutated along the way, they get killed by radiation and replaced with something else, and how most of the time that's either going to be neutral or actively harmful. Yeah, that is pretty much solid. You know, you have the 4 different letters in a DNA that represent different chemicals. Those get combined together in 3 blocks, and those blocks do something. As amino acids, they do something. That's a good explanation. But then he describes that as the dogma, the central dogma of molecular biology. Now that is smuggling in a judgment, because it's not dogma. That is testable hypothesis. That is theory. That is proven. That is the process of science. And by immediately attaching the word dogma to that, he's taking it out of science and putting it into something that is more belief-based. And that is already sort of smuggling in some judgments and weakening that as an idea, readying the ground for his idea to come along. And then his idea is essentially presaged by his own personal incredulity. You know, that version of evolution, he says it seems haphazard. It doesn't seem powerful enough. That's basically saying, I can't believe that would work. And he's saying that in a way just to open up a gap that only he can fill.
Oh,
but what he's missing with that is that system is haphazard. It doesn't need to be anything other than haphazard, because you have a huge amount of time to do that. If you have, tens, hundreds of thousands of years, then that amount of groping in the dark that evolution is doing, or that random mutation is doing, is occasionally going to stumble onto some light switches. And that's what's happening. Evolution isn't looking for a light switch. It's groping around in the dark and accidentally catching a light switch now and then. Yeah. The power is in the amount of time that it takes. And that's where his personal incredulity is hitting that wall. That's where it's coming from. So instead of just accepting that time alone can account for this, he has to invent something entirely new.
And in that clip, he very specifically says exactly what you said. Oh, well, people will say it's time. And then he never addresses it. He just says, yeah, but I don't think it's that powerful. And he also seems like he's saying, if you don't think, if it doesn't meet your belief structure, you in the audience, I have something for you. I have a thing that I can tell you that will then meld your belief structure with the current understandings of how evolution works. And I can be the one who puts a bridge over those two things through this theory that I have, which is essentially intelligent design. I mean, I don't want to say it's intelligent, but it's intelligent design.
There's a bit of that to it. It's a bit more complicated than that. But actually, it's really good that you point that out, that he's saying, like, if you have these problems, he's basically doing the infomercial, has this ever happened to you? When it's... I don't think the majority of Joe's listeners are thinking, hang on a second, I've always thought that time alone isn't powerful enough to explain the great power of evolution. He's putting that in their mind. He's giving them the problem and then saying, and if you have got that problem... Here's this new product from JML, from QVC that you can take on board.
Amazing. All right. So we're not cutting a lot of tape in this. This is all very much at the beginning of the show. This is just a continuation on. So the tape just continues.
Yeah. At the start of the show, he speaks for 19 minutes unbroken. From the moment that Joe starts him talking, it's like a full 19 minutes before Joe even pauses him and asks for a question. Yeah.
So he asks Joe once if he understands. Joe says yes, and then he goes back to it. That's essentially what happens. So this is the next bit of that tape. He's talking about the missing layer.
Okay, so I'm going to put a hypothesis on the table about what enhances this. And essentially what I'm arguing is if you sat down to a computer game, right, something very realistic, and somebody says, well, that's all binary. That's true. It's all binary. But what they're not telling you is that there's an intervening layer that greatly increases the power to use binary to make something like a computer game, right? So there are multiple different levels inside your computer. One of them is that your computer can be programmed in a language that is much closer to English, and then a compiler can take what you've written that a computer can't understand and turn it into a computer understandable code. And so the ability to make powerful programs depends on our ability not to have to program our computers in binary, but to be able to program them in C++ or whatever. That's the kind of thing I'm pointing to, is a mechanism that enhances the power of evolution to do the stuff that we know evolution accomplishes. Okay, so here's what I think is the missing layer. And I will say I've done a bunch of research to figure out how much of this is understood. And I find a very confusing picture.
Okay, so first of all, I like at the end he's saying he's done a lot of research into figuring how much of this is understood. That isn't research into the idea.
Right,
that's research into whether people accept the idea. It sounds like he's doing a lot of research, but the research is, does this make sense to you? Can you understand what I'm saying? That's not research. But he's drawing this analogy to computer programming. You've got binary, but then you've got this intervening layer of language over the top. But the thing is, that is still binary at the bones of it, right? At the bones of it, it's still binary. C++ or whatever coding language you're using is just essentially allowing us to write binary in ways that we can understand better. So when we say, do a thing that does this, C++, we code it in C++ or whatever language you're using, and that goes away and tells the computer, put the ones and zeros in this order in order to do that. Essentially, that's kind of like a very basic kind of version. We're not changing fundamentally how the computer works. But this analogy doesn't work because coding languages like that, that's all about translating one language into another. It's translating HTML into binary. It's translating C++ into binary. It's a translation in the middle that we're kind of on one side of. And it's doing that so that a conscious creature on one side can interpret and use it better in order to use the end result of it. So it has us on one side. We can't write in binary, so we have this intervening layer. But there is no consciousness driving evolution.
Yeah.
And there is also no goal that evolution is trying to achieve beyond the pure survival of genes into the future. We aren't trying to grow wings. We aren't trying to grow our brains. We aren't trying to be taller. We're just trying to survive as best we can. And whatever happens, whichever light switch we stumble onto along the way that achieves that, so much the better. But we weren't looking for the light switch. So he says that there's this intervening layer, but with evolution, there is nobody on the other side requiring that intervention. There's nobody on the other side of this.
And the framing to me feels a little intelligent designy already. And I think the reason why is because I think this is a real purposeful analogy. He's talking about coding. He's talking about you're taking the code and you're coding the DNA. And I think it's a bad analogy because someone's going to come along and say, well, computers, they can't code themselves, can they? They can't be the one who does the coding themselves. And I just think that's a bad analogy. Our DNA is in computers. It's more like a river running through a riverbank. It follows the path of least resistance. There's no planning. It's just how it flows. It's not like it goes in and says, oh, well, I've come up against this obstacle. Let me dig in my file drawer and find the thing that will get me around it. It'll just produce a shit ton of stuff to get around it. And the thing that gets around it gets to breed.
Yeah, absolutely. And that file drawer, he will come onto that file drawer. That file drawer, he believes it's there. He believes it's fundamental to his theory, in fact. But it just occurred to me, is he talking about the coding of a computer? Because we can't talk about blind watchmakers anymore because that as a way of forwarding intelligent design is such a well-known argument that people have heard of it. But this feels like an updated version of that argument, just using a different technology.
It does. Okay, so now he's going to bring up something pretty technical, and it's something we've talked about on the show before. We're skipping a few moments ahead in the tape. We're not missing much, and he's going to bring up telomeres.
So what I realized more than 25 years ago, many people who've heard you and me talk before will have heard us talk about my work on telomeres. So telomeres, you'll remember, are structures at the end of every chromosome that are not genes. They are repetitive sequences. They're written in DNA, but it's basically just a repeated series of letters again and again and again. And the telomere basically the number of repeats that are there dictates how many times a cell line can duplicate. It loses repeats each time it duplicates. And when it gets down to a critically low number, it stops reproducing. Now, we've talked before about why that system exists. The short version is in creatures like us, it prevents cancers from happening because if a cell line runs away and just starts reproducing, it runs into this limit, the Hayflick limit, and stops reproducing. So it prevents cancer, but it limits the amount of repair that we can do in a lifetime. So it causes us to senesce, to age and grow feeble as we do so. But what it said to me when I was doing that work was that there is a kind of information that can be stored in genomes, in DNA, that is not protein-oriented. It's not what we would call allelic. It's not written in three-letter codons. It's actually a number stored the same way you would store a variable in a computer program, right? The telomere, the length of the telomere, is a count of how many times a cell line is allowed to divide over a lifetime. It's a number. And what occurred to me all those years ago was that the ability to store a number in the genome is fantastically powerful.
So, first of all, we're not going to get distracted by his pronunciation of telomere. Everywhere I can see, I checked three different pronunciation dictionaries. It's telomere rather than telomere.
Thank you.
Maybe
I was going to have to correct my pronunciation.
No, I even checked it. Like in the phonetic alphabet, it's got the upside down E, which is like a short E sound. It's not the hard E. So I don't know where he's coming at that from. Maybe I'm wrong. Just everybody I've spoken to would call it telomere, including when I checked in with a friend of mine, my colleague at the Skeptic Society on Skeptics, Dr. Alice Howarth, who's got a PhD in biology. She pronounces it telomere. She's done a lot of work in that kind of area too. She helped confirm what I suspected about what Bret's saying here. I think Bret, for all the work he's done on telomeres over the last 25 years, I think he's subtly wrong about how to pronounce it, and he's subtly wrong on what it is and how it works. And I think he's wrong about it in a way that I would argue undermines his point. And I'm not an expert, but I have talked to biologists about that. So he's right that telomeres do indeed control how often a cell line can duplicate. These protective bits at the end of the DNA sequence so that if there's any damage, it first hits the telomere before it gets into the stuff that actually really matters. It's often compared to the little plastic bits at the end of your shoelaces. You know, that takes all the damage and they might slowly fray away, but they still hold the lace together. Without those, the lace would take damage and would just start to come apart quite quickly. So it's trying to do that. It's there to protect it in that kind of way. It doesn't code for anything about you. It's just to protect the gene. And when cells replicate, therefore, any loss of information is happening at the end in the telomere. So that telomere, the length of that telomere will take the loss, and it can take an amount of loss before it disappears. Each loss, it's going to lose a bit. When you run out of telomere to fritter away, the cell's no longer going to be able to replicate. And that's kind of when the cell is in trouble. So telomere attrition is limited by something called the Hayflick limit, which is the limit on cell replication imposed by the shortening of telomeres with each division. And when you get to the end stage, it's known as something called cellular senescence. But Bret's theory relies on each of those little fritters away being the Hayflick limit is an integer limit. He said it's coded like a number you can store in a computer variable, in the sense that it's a set number that the cell was already designed to be able to divide on. It's like a set in the cell's destiny, like the number's in there somewhere. That completely ignores the role of randomness in how much of the telomere gets damaged with each replication. Because the typical normal human fetal cell is going to divide 50 to 70 times before it experiences senescence. But that 50 to 70 isn't a specified number because at each slice, at each replication, it's going to take a different amount of telomere off. Bret is saying that there is an integer number. There is a solid number. This one can divide, this can replicate this number of times, and then it's dead. That isn't how it works. So his whole idea is going to be based on the fact that this number exists somewhere in the coding for this cell, and it's not true. And the analogy that I would draw, it's like saying if you had a glass of water and you were sloppily pouring that pint of water into another glass, you might end, if you're doing it very sloppily, you might end up losing some water along the way. But how many sloppy pours would it take before you lose, say, a full 10% of the water? Well, that's not going to be a solid number because it depends how sloppily you pour each time, how fast you're pouring, how much you lose each time, whether someone keeps knocking your arm, causing you to spill more sometimes. Sometimes during cell replication, something might happen that takes a bigger chunk off the telomere. So this is, and I'm going long on this for a reason, Bret's entire theory of why evolution is wrong, or what's missing from evolution, is fundamentally based on that number of divisions in the cell, number of replications in the cell being limited by a hard number that exists somewhere in the coding of that cell that isn't just random, but is actually a firm integer limit that it can't go less, it can't go more. That is what he believes, and I think he's wrong about how telomeres work, and that will be important through everything else he goes on to say.
He'd probably find that out if he printed an academic paper, I imagine. Probably find that out pretty quick.
I don't know what telomere research was like a quarter of a century ago. Maybe the field has moved on in 25 years and he ought to read some papers before he's, rather than coming on Joe Rogan and reinventing the field.
All right, so the next bit of tape, this is continuing on, and he's basically talking about DNA information.
What it means, if you could store a lot of numbers in the genome, is that you could describe creatures by allotting something, either a quantity of material or an amount of time in development, that you could specify things in the language of numbers that you can't specify in the language of amino acids. So the hypothesis that I'm putting on the table is that the evolutionary process has built a system in which variables, in which integers are stored in DNA, and those integers dictate phenomena like developmental timing, turning on and off something like the growth of one of those phalanx, the phalanges in the fingers. If you could radically increase the number that dictated the length of one of those bones, then selection would effectively be in a position to play with adjacent forms. So am I confusing you, or is this making sense?
It's making sense.
Okay.
So, Marsh, is that making sense?
I don't think it is making sense. So this is, again, it's based on that the idea that along with the integer, the specific number, identifiable number of how many times your telomeres can replicate on cells, if it contains that number, it might also contain some other numeric information in integer form, like as in a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 onwards. And that set of numbers that exists somewhere can control larger adaptations and developments outside of the genetic sequence. So this isn't about, the letters in your DNA and coming together into codons, which are these 3-letter sequences, and amino acids. He's saying outside of that codon and amino acid system is a separate system that has all these integers coded. It tells you how many times your cell can replicate. Therefore, why can't that number exist for lots of other things too? And that is something that he alone has hypothesized, and nobody, not even he, has discovered any evidence of at all. And that's because these coded numbers don't exist. The one that he was talking about with telomeres doesn't exist. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of telomeres. And the thing is, why would this alternative system even be necessary? Why do you need there to be something, a number somewhere around your DNA that tells you how long your finger can be? And if you could change that number, suddenly evolution will be like, oh, sweet, I've got so much more finger length to play with. Let's go nuts and see what I can do. That's not necessary. What does that explain about evolution, about creatures and reality and biology that evolution and time can't explain? I would argue nothing. This doesn't add to the system apart from adding speculation about something that no one has ever hypothesized or found any evidence of before. And I also think it's interesting that we covered it recently in the last series. Joe had Greg Braden on. Greg Braden also had issues with macroevolution. He believed in microevolution, but he had issues with humans having evolved. And he decided that we needed an extra system to explain that. And his system was aliens and God, and aliens who might be God. Bret apparently has also got issues, but he's come up with this other system, this integer system. Neither of these men have spent a lot of time really thinking about the time that's involved in evolution, because I think that would work the whole thing out.
So we're skipping ahead here, and there's a piece that we're cutting out, and the piece that we're cutting out is essentially a discussion on how evolution works, he's sort of describing a system that would evolve a squirrel to a flying squirrel. So essentially, the squirrel would be up high in the tree, either being chased by predators or it would be trying to get to another tree, and it would jump. And the ones that could reach that other tree through having little bits of extra flesh that they could float a little bit, or they're a little chubbier and they could get a little more girth going forward, however that would work, they could then use that evolutionary advantage, and then that would breed itself up into giving them, essentially the webbing that is between their arm and their body. And that would be the thing that would then create the flying squirrel over the regular old, squirrel that's in your tree. And he talks about that for about, I would say maybe about 10 minutes. He describes this to Joe, and they talk about how that it evolved from a squirrel to a flying squirrel. And when he mentioned flanges in the last clip, he was talking about the fingers of the flying squirrel in between the webbing. So he's already kind of in that little bit as well. Yeah. And that's all to lead up to this piece, which is where he introduces this idea called explorer modes.
So those individuals that had just slightly more webbing outcompeted those individuals that had slightly less webbing.
But what would cause them to develop the webbing in the first place?
Well, that's just it. Is
that random mutation? Is that?
Well, yeah, I would say at some level these things all have to start there. But my overarching point is selection not only discovers forms, it discovers ways to discover forms. So I call these ways explorer modes. This is a concept I've taken a certain amount of crap over, but I'm quite convinced of it. I would argue that our consciousness is an explorer mode, right? Our consciousness allows us to come up with ideas that might be useful and to kind of test them in our heads and to figure out how we would try them out in life, and then to build a prototype and see how it works, and then discover how it might be improved. And, sooner or later you get from, the Wright Flyer of 1903, which can stay off the ground for barely half a minute, to not so many years later, a modification of the same aircraft that can circle the Eiffel Tower. Right? It's that process. That is the ability to explore design space in some way that is not random.
So this is where I think he's starting to get into unnecessary speculation. He's talking about these explorer modes. And he first of all says, like, our consciousness is that, but he's also talking about the squirrel and webbing and things. And this is coming off the back of him talking about there being these pre-programmed options, these integer options for like length of finger and things like that animals already have in their genetic back pocket, should the right circumstances become available. Like, somehow part of the flying squirrel's DNA has an integer-based setting for the length of webbing it might be able to develop, just in case it ever finds itself in a position where there'd be an advantage to being able to glide at all. And all of that implies forethought. And forethought is there when he says about consciousness. Yeah, we have consciousness, we can do forethought, but the rest of it, for flying squirrels, forethought, planning, intentionality, none of that is how evolution works. At no point did any squirrel or anything responsible for the creation of squirrels think, do you know what would be good if this squirrel could fly a little bit further than the next one? Yeah. That's not how this works at all. And he's starting to put intentionality and planning overlaid onto evolution here.
Right. And I think purposefully using consciousness as a analogy here, that makes it seem like there's some sort of plan. There's some sort of plan that's working forward. There's some sort of idea, and it needs to be able to sort of, like we suggested earlier, reach into that toolbox and figure some things out. That implies that there's something there that's helping create this new thing. It's a creation of something. It's not like a happy accident, right? It's not like this thing was created through brute force and now it exists. It's this thing was created very purposefully through something that thought about how it could overcome something. All right, so now he's talking about genome variables in this next clip.
And to the extent that the genome is capable of storing a large number of variables and then applying them, what that means is at the point that you have the first true bat, right, the first flyer, that animal has discovered an adaptive landscape, a series of opportunities that we represent as peaks that is unknown, right? What can you do if you can fly that you couldn't do when you could only climb? Well, you can move between distant trees and collect fruit. You can catch insects that are flying on the wing. You can seek out mammals and birds and slit them open and drink their blood. You can catch fish that come to the surface and cause ripples. These are all things that bats do. And the point is the initial bat presumably didn't do much of any of that. It did probably a generalist something. But having achieved flight, there's a question about how evolution can find all of the opportunities that are now suddenly available. And the idea that this happens through occasional random mutation of a protein coding gene that alters something important is, in my opinion, ridiculous. That more likely, vastly more likely, is a system in which parameters like finger length and the length of each phalanx in the finger is stored as a variable, and those variables get readily modified. In other words, if you looked at the hand of every human being, you would see that there's already a ton of variation in, the relative lengths of the different digits and the relative lengths to each of the knuckles. And that if those things are reflective of a particular state stored as essentially an integer in the genome, that all of the adjacent states are very available. And therefore, evolution can explore what Stuart Kauffman would call the adjacent possible.
So you see, he's talking about bats here. I think he was actually talking about bats in the last clip when he was talking about the webbing. He wasn't talking about the webbing under the arms of flying squirrels. It was actually the webbing between the phalanxes, the fingers of bats. But he was making exactly the same point. I just forgot which animal he was talking about there. But here we are, he's talking about bats. And this all sounds rather bogged down in like terminology and language. But what he's therefore suggesting, when you really listen here, is that there's an existing evolutionary storage of all of the possible variables that a bat might need that he says is coded into the DNA as integers. And I keep saying integers because that's what he's using there. So he means a number, which those numbers all exist. And therefore the bat as a species can turn those off and on as and when it might need them, rather than discover things through experimentation and mutation and randomness and things like that. So in theory, if a bat entered an environment where having a third eye in the back of its head would be useful, it might be able to develop one as long as 3 was one of the possible integer numbers for numbers of eyes already written somewhere in its DNA. And when I say in its DNA, he's not talking about the genetic code, the amino acids, the 4-letter sequences. That's not what he's talking about. He means somewhere else. And he thinks that could happen even if there had never been a 3-eyed bat before. And I don't think this is possible. He also talks about like the finger length and things like that. And he talks about the variation on human beings of finger length. But our variation between generations is gradual. I will have very similar hands within a certain, flexibility of margin of error to my dad because I've inherited his genes. It isn't like if I found myself in a situation, if my dad had found himself in a situation where having a son with a much, much larger hand would be beneficial, DNA would say, oh, I think I've got a number somewhere for a finger 3 times the length. Yeah. Here you go, turn that on and off you go. That's not how this works, but it's sort of what Bret's suggesting here. And this is his revolutionary theory on evolution.
And now he's going to introduce an idea called the adjacent possible.
Right? So if you have a rodent of one size and there is, let's say you have a rodent that specializes on a particular seed and it exists in a habitat where there's another seed that's similar but much bigger, well, then you need to access the adjacent possible in order for a second species or subspecies of this rodent to evolve to take advantage of this untapped resource. So if you think of all of the things that you've got, and then all of the things that you might want that are similar, that's the adjacent possible. And my point is variables as one of the primary modes of information storage in the genome provides a mechanism for evolution to explore the adjacent possible in a radically more effective way than the story we typically tell about random mutations to protein coding genes, right? There's nothing un-Darwinian about this. Darwin didn't know anything about genes, probably to his advantage in the long term, because if he had understood genes, he might have made many of the same mistakes that we made in the middle of the 20th century in evolution, where we became overly focused on the genes we understood. But basically, everything that Darwin said was about a vague hereditary information, and numbers is no less a candidate for that than triplet codons stored that code for amino acids. So my point is, Darwin is untouched by this. Darwin is still the guy. He nailed it. And this is just as Darwinian as protein coding genes. It's just vastly more powerful with respect to taking a form that you've already got and finding a similar form that you don't yet have.
So again, a lot of quite dense scientific language and terminology here. One point he says towards the end there, like numbers is no less a candidate for that vague hereditary information than triplet codons stored for amino acids. Well, integers are less of a candidate because we have no evidence that they exist. We have evidence that triplet codons and DNA and amino acids come together to genes and that forms heritability. We've got evidence. We proved that over time. Bret has hypothesized that there is an integer level of storage somewhere. Hasn't said where that could possibly be. I think he speculates at some point it might be existing somewhere in the junk DNA or around the DNA, but he still doesn't think it's kind of coded in letters and amino acids. So he just says there is a system somewhere with numbers somehow, based on the idea that telomeres have a very specific number of times that a cell can replicate, which isn't true because he's misunderstood how telomeres work. That's why his number theory is less of a candidate, because there's no evidence for it, it's never been observed, and it doesn't make sense. That makes it less of a candidate. And then he's talking, and I think this is really important, he's talking about his theory allows for evolution to be radically more effective. But effective at what? That's the question. Because it implies that there's some kind of goal that life forms are trying to reach, and that there is an optimizable pathway to get there. But that is not how it works. We're not trying to get anywhere. Like, the cats aren't trying to become us and have just taken the wrong step along the way, and give us enough time and they'll get there. There is no pinnacle of evolution. It's just about carrying on. And he says evolution, it's not efficient enough. But evolution isn't efficient. We aren't efficient creatures. We have evidence of how inefficient evolution has been everywhere. So he says evolution couldn't be so efficient as to get us there. Well, evolution is really inefficient. Our eyes, right? You wear glasses. I've had laser surgery. Our eyes aren't particularly good as a species. They're given to wearing out. They're given to having less accuracy than we need. They evolved a lens. That means that we see images upside down and the brain has to flip that on the way through. That's inefficient. They've evolved a big blind spot in the middle of the eye that the brain has to just pretend isn't there. That's inefficient. If we move our eyes from side to side too fast, we get a series of snapshots that the brain has to pretend is a smooth picture. All of this is so inefficient. And that's just the eyes. That's just one organ. We could carry on. All of the creatures that exist today are filled with inefficiencies and inconsistencies and oddities. And that's because evolution is slow and it is inefficient. It doesn't take a magical pathway to get here. There's no mystery for it to explain here. And equally, the way that a species changes from one species into another is incredibly slow. It's incredibly incremental. We've seen that even in the way that the speed of that we've been changing the landscapes around us has led so many animals to be pushed to extinction. Species change over vast timescales, so those timescales are so much vaster than our brains can naturally comprehend and process. If Bret was right, and there was this really effective secondary coding layer going on that we didn't know about that allowed creatures to optimize their options for development, we would have much clearer evidence of animals changing much more rapidly over fewer generations. Right. And we don't have that. There's just no evidence to support any of this stuff.
So he's going to mention a thing called Evo-Devo in this, and he's going to say that out loud. That's evolutionary developmental biology is what he's going to bring in on this next clip.
Now, there's lots of nuances about how this could work. There's lots of questions I certainly can't answer. I will say, as I was mentioning at the top, this story seems to be largely unaddressed in adaptive evolution space. If I come at it from the Evo-Devo side, I see much more description of mechanisms that work like this. But I don't see the revolution that should happen when you've come to understand that you have this very powerful additional evolutionary mechanism. That should be causing a massive uptick in the power of what we can address adaptively. And it does not seem to be there. So now, I'm not in a university anymore. I'm not primarily working as a biologist. So it's possible I've missed something. But there's, as you know, we have massively dysfunctional institutions. And I've thought my field was stuck in a ditch since really before I entered it. The last major progress in my field was 1976. And
really,
that's what I think.
So, yeah, this is what you were saying at the start here, that this should be overturning everything. The thing that he's come up with, he thinks should be absolutely revolutionary. And the fact that it isn't is proof that the institutions of science and higher learning are broken.
Right.
It's not proof that it might be wrong or that he has no evidence for his theory, nor that there's any evidence for any need for his theory. There's no gap for his theory to even fill, even if it was a solid theory or had any evidence. It's because the institutions of learning are broken. So he's come up with a theory that doesn't really make sense, requires a level of information storage and access that there's no evidence for, based on a single example that he's wrong about, in order to explain problems in the biological history that don't exist. And when the entire world doesn't immediately get on board and change everything about that, everything based on that, that's a sign that the systems of learning are dysfunctional. That's what he's saying here.
Yeah. And I think that comment, massively dysfunctional institutions, is a nod to people who listen to Joe's show who really, really hate higher education, who really dislike higher education. And I also think Joe, in a lot of ways, depending on the scope of the study, the realm of the study, he may think that very specific area of study is intellectually sort of bullying him. I don't know if you've heard this before, but he will make voices for people. He will treat certain areas of study as if they are so less and unneeded and a waste of time. And I think that there's a lot of people who listen to his show that really do fall into all those people are book smart, but we're street smart over here, and we're out here in the real world. And I think like those types of people, this comment really sells what he's talking about to them.
Yeah, I think so. And it opens them up to other times that Joe has someone talking about evolution, like Greg Braden, who is pushing intelligent design. It opens them up to accepting that, because here you've got a PhD biologist saying, well, evolution's broken in so many ways.
All right, so this is the last clip in the main event. This is talking about adaptive radiation.
So, for example, we have a process. It's one of my favorites to think about, which is called adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is where you get some creature that either solves some problem or gets to some new place and then diversifies, and we get 50 or 100 or 1,000 species that are derived from that initial discovery, right? So you get this blooming of forms, right? The first bird, what was the first bird even doing? We don't know.
Right.
But what we do know is that we have 11,000 species of these things now, all doing subtly different stuff, right?
Some of them not even flying.
Right. Some of them have lost the ability to fly. So the point is, the discovery of birdness opens up a huge number of potential discoveries. Evolution would be a dumb process if it didn't effectively search that space. If it randomly waited to find each of those opportunities, that's so much less powerful than searching the space. And then once you get the search of a space, okay, so you get 100 hits. You get some innovation. It provides 100 niches that you could move into from there. It creates 100 species. And it turns out most of those niches are durable on the scale of 10,000 years, but not 50,000 years. So you get a bunch of them going extinct. But as long as one of them or two of them have gotten through that bottleneck, right? The huge blooming of branches and then the pruning of branches, the ancestor has now gotten to the future in the form of however many species made it through that destructive process. It is selection at a different scale than we typically think of it.
So he says here, and it's just a throwaway comment in the middle, but I think it's important. He says, what was the first bird doing? It was, like, we don't know that. It was being a dinosaur, Bret. Come on, man. Like, it was, yeah.
I don't know, man. I think the first bird was crossing a road. I thought that, isn't that how that goes? I don't know.
But it seems to suggest that he thinks birds just came out of nowhere, and they didn't. Like,
Nothing up my
he still
sleeve.
has in his mind that idea that the Greeks used to have, that certain Greek philosophers, that maggots used to just spontaneously be created by rotten meat because they couldn't see that flies were laying eggs.
Right, yeah.
It's the same that birds just sprang out of nowhere. Like a dinosaur, slowly, like we think they were probably feathered, and they slowly used those feathers, like the flying squirrel, like the bat, in order to gain themselves a bit of extra height when they jumped. And before they knew it, they were able to keep themselves off the ground because generation on generation on generation improved it. Birds didn't just appear out of nowhere. We have the evolutionary line. What are you talking about? And he says, and all this, he says, it just seems like that would be a dumb process. Evolution would be a dumb process if it didn't effectively search the space of all the possibilities. Evolution is a dumb process because the opposite of that is an intelligent process, and an intelligent process would require an intelligence or a god or as much as anything, a goal. You know, the dinosaurs that evolved into birds weren't sat around going, I wonder how I could figure out how to fly.
Yeah.
They just were able to do it over time because it was beneficial along the way. They weren't trying to achieve anything. And Bret seemed to fundamentally misunderstand that. And he's a PhD biologist.
And it's an intense amount of time. Like people, that's the thing is, it's not just like a couple of years or a couple of generations or whatever. This is an intensely long time. And Bret is throwing that out as, and he never addressed that. He never addressed that in the beginning. And that's the answer to all of the things that he's been saying so far, is that if you just add time into the equation, it makes it so like that makes a lot more sense. He also talks about it, how it needs to be powerful. It doesn't need to be powerful in order for it to function. You know, a small, tiny little stream can dig out a huge gorge if you have enough time. And so that it doesn't have to be powerful for it to work. It just needs to be able to, it just needs to eventually reach that other piece that we see as the goal. It's not necessarily a goal, but it's the piece in time that we're saying it reached this. It doesn't have to do that to be powerful. It doesn't have to be powerful in order to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And so much of this, we could have termed so much of this as the toolbox of the argument from personal incredulity.
Yes.
I can't believe evolution would be this unguided and still get to where we are today. Therefore, it has to be guided.
Yes.
But that, in many ways, is the benefit of hindsight as well.
Sure.
You know, it's the, like, we've got to here. Well, how did we get here? And it's the analogy of cutting your way through a thick undergrowth and then looking back and marveling about how you managed to cut your way exactly along the path that's behind you.
Yeah.
Like, it's only a path. It's only the path to the destination in retrospect. It wasn't a destination to begin with until you got there, and then it was your destination. So he's missing all of this, and he's terming it all through like personal incredulity. There must be more to evolution than this.
All right, we're going to move on to our undercard.
And the undercard's banging. The undercard's filled with fights.
Okay, so we're starting out the undercard. Now, this undercard is leaning towards some of their ideas on religion, some of their ideas on how to reach people that are involved in that sort of thing, and specifically, it starts to talk about sex and sexuality. And in order to get to those parts, that piece about sex and sexualities and incel culture, we've got to start at the beginning. And this is when they're starting to talk about intelligent design.
Here's the real question, specifically in regards to flying.
Yep.
How does an animal go from being a shrew or some other rodent type creature to something that eventually can fly? And what are the steps along the way? And how would that even facilitate itself? Like how would you get an animal that's completely stuck on the ground and can only hop a little bit to something that can literally traverse 3D space?
This is why I love you, Joe. I mean, it's one of the reasons. This is a question that has perplexed biologists. We have done a lot of work. We know a lot.
It's one of the most fantastic abilities of all the animals.
Right. how surprising is it? That's the
Yes.
question. Is it so surprising that it's actually impossible? And I think the answer is just simply no. It's quite possible.
Well, it's possible.
Well, no. I mean, let's steel man the opposing position.
Intelligent design position?
There's certainly a lot of people who would argue that actually no, there are gaps you can't jump.
We should explain that as well. Like, this is one of the reasons why this argument has come up, because intelligent design asserts that random mutation and natural selection does not account for the vast variety of species, and it could not account for a rodent or a shrew, which is believed to be our common ancestor, eventually becoming a human being.
Let's just say I have, initially I thought that all of the intelligent design folks were anti-scientific and really basically just religious people wielding sophistry. I now know several of them in person and quite like them, and I quite like them scientifically. I think they actually have done an excellent job of pointing out the folly in evolutionary biology. And in part, what I'm saying is I appreciate their pointing out that the mechanism that we teach is not powerful enough to do what we claim it does. I have the same suspicion. My argument is there is a mechanism that is powerful enough, and we haven't been looking at it because we've been telling the story that we've got it nailed already, and I just don't think we do.
So this, I think, is pretty key to what's wrong with Bret's hypothesizing on evolution. Intelligent design absolutely is pseudoscientific, regardless of how many intelligent designers you've met in person and had dinner with, and how much you like them and found them charming.
Yeah.
Intelligent design is designed to dismiss an idea first and foremost, and then look for just anything at all you can use to back that up. That isn't how science works. And when they do that, despite what Bret says, they're not doing an excellent job in pointing out the folly in evolutionary biology. What they're trying to do is erode and obfuscate our scientific knowledge and what we actually know. And they're doing that through deceptive linguistic tricks and a reliance mainly on their audience not knowing that they're doing it. Okay? But because Bret has met somebody, knows them personally, now he's biased to listen to them. And because he's got his own ideas about the inadequacy of evolutionary theory, well, he's going to take any allies he can get along the way.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. And I think, when he says it's sophistry looking for gaps in an argument to chalk God in those gaps, yeah, that's exactly what it is. That's exactly that. And just because you know somebody who is an intelligent designer and you're friends with them and you had dinner with them doesn't mean they're right about anything.
Yeah. But intelligent design, fundamentally, it doesn't look for any substantive criticisms of science because that isn't its goal. So saying that they're doing a good job of critiquing biology because you happen to have your own evolutionary theory is like saying that you think QAnon had an excellent point about Hillary Clinton drinking the blood of babies because you disliked her foreign policy proposals.
Yeah.
It's not valid.
So now we're going to start shifting into talking more about humans, their sexuality, and this is where we start to get into that incel talk.
I will say, in parallel with what I think is a much more toxic environment, and developmentally toxic environment, we have a radical change in the way human beings are interacting with each other.
Right.
And it is unclear to me how far-reaching the consequences of that might be. But, we talked last time about the impact of the sexual revolution and of reliable birth control and abortion on the way males and females interact with each other. That basically sex being the ultimate reward, the most powerful motivator that exists. When birth control made sex common, or made it possible for sex to be common by virtue of radically reducing the risk that females face in engaging in sex with men who won't invest, it robbed us of the central organizing principle of civilization, and the consequences of that central organizing principle evaporating are incredibly far-reaching, right? In effect, we do not know that there is a way for us to live without that central organizing principle. We don't know that it lasts. And we are running that radical experiment, and then we're going to augment that radical experiment now with AI and presumably AI-powered sex robots and companions and other things that the mind is not built to properly understand.
So, yeah, when he says the impact of the sexual revolution, to be clear, he doesn't mean the positive impact of the sexual revolution.
Right.
He's pretty clear that he thinks there's some serious negative impacts, including apparently birth control having robbed us of the central organizing principle of civilization, which, birth control give women access to their own autonomy here. It's pretty clear that he's talking about that being a bad thing, that women shouldn't be able to have sex with men without them facing the repercussions rather than the men. Right. That's what he's talking about here. That's the central organizing principle.
Yeah. And we cut a piece of tape here, but there's a bit right before this where Joe was just talking about plastics and toxins in the environment. And this is what the conversation shifts to. It shifts to this. So he had a sort of in the barrel, a plan to talk about this very specific thing when what they were talking about beforehand was toxins in the environment and how they have to shift, like how there's plastics in our systems and things like that. And he very specifically shifts it to, let's talk about birth, let's talk about sex, let's talk about the sexual revolution, and let's talk about how things have changed for men culturally. All right, so this is really interesting and very specific wording about desirable things.
But is it possible that we can move past the idea that providing people or a person being able to provide themselves with shelter and food, which is essentially what we're saying with universal basic income? We're saying you will have enough money to have shelter, you will have enough money to have food, and you could acquire basic goods. That this is not really what we should be working towards in life anymore, and that it's possible to find some other purpose, goal, or task that would replace those things, and money would just be a thing that you're using to acquire the means to survive, and now you pursue this other thing, maybe not necessarily for a monetary reason, not necessarily to acquire wealth, but instead to educate yourself, and instead, as a process of human development, a skill that you're learning, a thing that you're competing in, something.
Sure.
It gives you meaning.
Except for one thing. What has to be true at the end of that substitute purpose is some undeniably valuable reward, right?
Because that's the motivating factor.
That's the thing that will cause you to do it.
Right.
Right. So not starving is a great motivation, right?
Right.
Being able to buy stuff is a decent enough motivation to the extent that there is stuff that's desirable that's out of reach unless you get enough wealth. That's a decent enough motivation. I think nothing is going to substitute for the difficulty of for males, the difficulty of winning the ability to have a sexual relationship with a desirable female, right?
It's interesting the point that you made about that last clip, because he's done it again here. Joe is talking about universal basic income. We've seen him on this trip before. If you're not working for shelter, if you're not working for food money, what is your purpose? What goal are you going to have? And he spends a lot of time talking about that, goals and tasks and what you could be doing and, educating yourself and developing yourself. And Bret brings it back to, but sex has to be the reward. Sex is just a reward. And I don't think we see Joe see women that way by himself. It's only when he's talking to someone like this that this kind of the conversation really goes in this direction. Bret is very clearly here treating women as a commodity, as a goal. They are a destination that men can get to if they have the right variables, integer variables programmed into their life. Right. And the fact that they include desirable women in there as well. Men, the difficulty of winning the ability to have sexual relationships with a desirable woman. The inclusion of the word desirable seems really key there, because this plays into that incel kind of language, really. I think it really does.
Yeah.
They're not talking about women who I would argue are probably just as interested in winning, if they want to use the word winning, a sexual relationship with a desirable male. You know, a lot of straight women are also trying to have sex with men they find attractive, but women's needs don't kind of come up here at all because they're a commodity, they're a goal.
Sure don't. Sounds like a dog whistle to me, to a certain group and a certain audience. It's also, I just want to touch on that piece that keeps coming up in Joe's show. That piece about UBI, that piece about meaning in your life, these are two guys shooting the shit and recording it and making money off of it, right? This is like literally the easiest podcast in the world to do because there's no planning. They don't do anything except for sit and talk, right? They don't even bother to do any research beforehand. They just sit and have a conversation, and then they make intense loads of money off of it, and then they shame the people who listen as if they need to be out there being worker bees. You got to get out there and bust your ass because if you don't do it, you'll never find meaning. Where's your meaning, dude? Where's your hard work ethic that you have? You're sitting down, drinking bourbon, smoking cigars, and having conversations with a buddy that you didn't even prepare for, and somehow that is fulfilling. That's the work. That's hard work. And I think that's just a slap in the face to the people who listen. Really, genuinely, the people, the sort of blue collar, I think, demographic that would probably be the one that would pick up Joe Rogan's show. Every single episode, he's shaming you into thinking you deserve the life you have.
Yeah, exactly. If you didn't have that job, you'd have nothing. You'd be nobody. You wouldn't have any interests or anything like that. And yeah, I agree.
All right, so we're going to get there eventually. Here comes a little bit of porn and sex robots.
We now have all sorts of things that cause people not to want to pursue that. There are things, you know, obviously there's porn. There's going to be sex robots. So that
prostitution,
right. And, you know, part of me is wondering why women are not up in arms over the fact that they are being competed with ever more sophisticated technology. I'm confused by why that is not an affront.
Okay, I would say maybe it's because women don't see their value purely on their fuckability. You know? Jenny, maybe women feel relaxed about the fact that the Fuckbot 3000 won't be any kind of substitute or competition for a living, breathing, thinking, talking, dreaming human being like them.
Why hasn't Bret sent messages to all the sex stores with big rubber dicks? You know what I mean? Like, why? If that's what he's worried about, if he's saying women should be worried because they can be replaced by this fuckbot. Well, dude, you can be replaced by a big rubber cock. Like, there's nothing stopping somebody from doing that, and those have been around for a really long time.
Yeah, we don't know that he hasn't done that. We don't know that he hasn't sent those letters to dildo purveyors across America. We don't know that.
I mean, he's got to write something. It's not an academic paper, so he might as well write a note to a sex store about how he's threatened by a big rubber cock. Get the hell out of here. This is genuinely disgusting. This is a gross, misogynistic way to look at the value of women and how they should value themselves. Again, we're not shifting off of this. This is porn and women.
I think some women are. They're definitely at arms about porn, and they think that not only are they competing with this, but it's changing young men's view of sex.
Oh, I think it absolutely is. In fact, I think, you know,
it's much more rejected amongst women.
That is not what I'm hearing.
Really?
From my sons.
I'm hearing. Oh, okay. What are you hearing?
That women are increasingly involved with porn. That it's
really,
yes, and which surprises
involved
me.
in the creation or the viewing, watching it. God, that was never the case when I was young.
Oh, of course not. No, I think it's not.
If you went over a girl's house and she had a collection of porn, that was a fucking warning signal.
Huge red flag.
Run.
Right. Well, I think, you know, I don't. There are plenty of voices out there that are focusing on the defects of modern women. I don't want to add to that chorus, but I do think there is something shocking about the degree to which young women seem to have signed up for the idea that being liberated, that the measure of whether or not they have been liberated is how much they are behaving like men at their worst.
Right. Like the boss lady is the lady that behaves like a man at work.
Behaves like a man at work. Treating sex very casually is not a normal thing for females to do. And
right. And it's in a lot of films, it's shown as a sign of character for the woman.
Exactly.
The woman's just a boss bitch and she doesn't give a fuck and she kicks these men to the curb and they're distraught and they're like emotionally wrecked and she's just back to business. Get to work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Weird.
The whole thing is weird.
Because it's so unattractive, too.
It's really unattractive.
Yeah, it's odd. I mean, it's odd to even say that it's unattractive, but look, I find it unattractive in men.
So this is an extraordinary exchange, I think. First of all, why is Bret's son talking to him about the porn habits of the women that he knows?
That is fucking weird, bro. Straight up weird, yo.
Who talks to their dad about what porn their girlfriends are into? What is going on in the Weinstein household?
That is a weird dinner. You know, pass the broccoli. Really, by the way, my girl, it's very strange.
Unbelievable. But yeah, so let's address the fact that Joe's saying it would have been a massive red flag if any woman when he was growing, like when he was younger, was into porn. Well, maybe the reason that women were less into porn when you were younger, Joe, was that the porn back then was made by men for men, in which women were nothing but sex objects and rewards.
Right.
Which are the themes that you've expressed in this very conversation. Like, your views have not moved on. Bret's views have not moved on from that time that women were only to be seen as a reward for something to be, like they are something to have sex with.
Yeah.
Maybe women wouldn't be interested in porn if that's their role in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is straight up incel shit, right? Like this is not, you can't separate this from anything. This is straight up incel shit. This is, when someone's saying the defects of modern women, a lot has been said about it, and I don't want to add to that. Do you fucking hear yourself, man?
Yeah, especially when Bret confirms in this conversation that he watches incel stuff on YouTube.
Yeah,
he doesn't believe in all of it, but he follows it and he finds it funny. But when he says some things like, he says, treating sex very casually is not a normal thing for females to do. That could have come straight from an incel subreddit directly.
Absolutely. And Joe... I think Joe definitely has some severe misogyny that runs through his veins. And here he has some where I think he dislikes any woman who is self-assured. And this is a moment where he can sort of bag on women that have a lot of confidence. And he does here. He says, I don't like the women who don't give a fuck. And then he mentions too, he says, men at their worst is what women want to be in the workplace. And it's like, dude, you're describing the patriarchy and getting ahead in the patriarchy. We all think that's bad. It's bad for men. It's bad for women. The reason why women need to act like men in most spheres of power is because of the patriarchy. That's why they do it. You're describing the way men act and then blaming women for it.
Yeah, exactly. And also just think about the conservative framing, the incredibly, and I mean that with a small c, like the conservative sexual morals and values kind of thing here. Watching porn, engaging in sexuality at all, those are traits that women can't have. Women don't have those traits, and men only have them at their worst. Yeah. This is puritanical kind of stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. And then there's that line at the end where both of these guys are like, and that's just so unattractive. Who the fuck cares what you think is unattractive? Yeah. What a weird thing to throw in there. Some weird vibe thing you're sending out to your audience to tell them what you think is unattractive and what other people should think is unattractive.
Yeah, imagine telling any of the women in positions of power when he's talking about women being bosses, oh, by the way, if you act that way, Joe Rogan might find you unattractive. So do with that information what you will. I don't think there's a lot of people changing their behavior off the strength of that verdict.
All right, we didn't skip a lot of tape here, like maybe 10 seconds or so, and they're still talking about the same topic.
I think men and women are obviously substantially different.
That's a controversial statement.
It really shouldn't be. It really shouldn't be. But I will just say I have puzzled over the fact that our culture does not have a profound relationship with the symmetry represented by a yin-yang symbol. The yin-yang symbol is profound as far as I'm concerned because it describes a perfect symmetry that is not superficially symmetrical, right? It's a complementarity that is, I think it's a very proper description of what you're actually searching for in a mate, in a marriage, right? You are not looking for somebody to be the same as you. You are looking for somebody to be as perfectly complementary with what you are as is possible in essentially every regard. And what we are getting instead is this sort of mind-numbing belief that, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, which it, as I keep saying, it has robbed us of all coherence.
So that's what's robbed Bret of all coherence, apparently. That's if he seems low on coherence, that's what's robbed him of it.
Wow.
I'll just be pointing out here, the yin-yang symbol has simple rotational symmetry. He says, like there's nothing, it's not perfectly symmetrical. It's just symmetry. It's not, it's pretty straightforward here. Look, there are differences between men and women, but there are also huge behavioral overlaps, especially when you take away patriarchal control and the expectations that come from patriarchy. That's when people aren't forced into performing certain gender roles and aren't shamed if they don't fit into those narrow categories of what is expected of their gender, then people will express themselves, and what we'll find is there is much less of a behavioral difference between men and women. When you have things like birth control and things like that too. What these men essentially mean here is that they want there to be big differences between men and women, and they want those differences to be the traditional gender roles that they grew up with, which they are expressing in this conversation is the normal state. That is the right state. That is the central organizing principle of society that birth control and the sexual revolution robbed us of.
So this next bit is talking about, he's still talking about porn, and this leads into this next segment where he's talking about sex.
And the story of how men and women are supposed to interact, in terms of flirting and dating and all of that is not as straightforward as people will paint that picture. But if you've got a generation of men that's being exposed to the same, frankly, violent garbage, and that is informing them about what sex is, and then women are discovering that, oh yeah, men are kind of brutal and awful, in the bedroom. So that reinforces their sense of, well, these aren't decent people. They're putting on an act when they're in public. So it creates the exact thing that men were falsely accused of. And it makes women, I think, become very unsympathetic as people, right? That to the extent that women start viewing sex as antagonistic, which is what men at their worst are. They're predators, right? They're men trying to have sex with women they have no intention of investing in are, whether they understand it or not, engaging in behavior designed to impregnate that female and stick her with the job of raising the offspring. That's
evolutionarily.
Yes. That's parasitic and predatory. Okay. That is a mode that exists in men, but it's not the only male mode.
And it's a mode that is a relic of ancient times when it was just an opportunity to spread your genes because you weren't going to live very long. So you had this built-in desire to try to spread your genes as much as possible.
Yeah, but I would also say that women were wise about not getting stuck with offspring. So the fact that men may have that mode built into them did not manifest as successful males behaving in this way because in general, women shut them down. And the fact
then birth control came along.
Right. And now women don't shut them down.
So what he's saying here is men learn violent sex from porn. It's porn's fault that men learn violent sex. And then women experience men who believe that's normal. And as a result, they falsely accuse all men of being predators. And that's women's fault for doing that. They've learned that and now they're falsely accusing people. Well, even if we were to accept all that framing, and I don't accept all that framing, the answer to all that is still to teach people better sex ed. But equally, both these men are in denial about how many men are predators and how many accusations here weren't false, because there were a lot of non-false accusations in there. And he gets to this thing. How is it true from an evolutionary perspective that men want to parasitically impregnate as many women as possible and stick her with the job of raising offspring? Even if and that's accepting Bret's premise that anybody who has sex with a woman they're not intending to marry is engaging in behavior that is evolution, that is harkening back to this parasitic evolutionary state, rather than, for example, enjoying a connection with somebody, enjoying having fun with somebody who always wanted fun, all these things that the sexual revolution allows people to do if they want to do. But he's saying this evolutionary, from an evolution perspective. Well, think about that for a moment. If this was true, that men, from an evolution perspective, are hardwired to impregnate as many women as possible and not invest in them and leave them alone to raise the baby, if they do that, women left alone in the wild to raise the baby in those times, without a partner, will be less likely to be able to get that baby to adulthood to a point where that baby could then pass on your genes. Impregnate 100 women in the wild in times and leave them to fend for themselves. How many of those babies survive? Probably not that many, because babies are completely helpless, and having one parent to raise them isn't as good as having two, especially in a more harsh environment. Compare that to having a baby with somebody and sticking around to at least initially help raise it. We could just as easily say that evolutionarily, men have more of a drive and an impulse and an incentive to ensure the safe upbringing of the few offsprings that they have, to invest in them in order for those offspring to reach maturity and then pass those genes along, which is actually how we've always lived as a species, in tribes and communities, it takes a village to raise children. We haven't had this widespread men having 100 babies and leaving them all, and women having to fend for themselves. That's just not really been how it's been, apart from outliers. What's happening here, he's letting his own, as we've seen, incredibly conservative attitudes to sex color what he then says is evolutionary imperative. He's an evolutionary biologist, but he's not following the science first or even the logic first. He's going from his prudish and puritanical sexual impulses first and foremost.
I don't understand why he doesn't just make women more puritanical through an explorer mode, if that's the case. I mean, this is evolutionary. Why not just do that, right?
Just turn that sexual impulse from a 1 to a 0
in their integer
for
it, right?
Exactly.
Brett, there's an integer in there.
And notice that the enemy to all of this is birth control and the women who didn't shut all of that down. It was birth control that gave us that. What a surprise that it's women's fault after all.
This is the last clip in our undercard. This is Brett's rules.
I keep waiting for a movement to start in which young people who have yet to form these relationships put out a set of rules. And they say, here are the rules I'm going to abide by, and I'm only going to date people who abide by them too, right? No porn, no robots. I would say this, if I was writing the rules, one of them would be no sex with somebody that you know is not a long-term partner. You're not committing to a long-term relationship when you have sex with somebody necessarily, but if you know somebody's not a candidate, you shouldn't be engaging in baby-making behavior with them, right? That's bad.
What a surprise that his rules include no sex before marriage.
Yeah, right? He's describing a promise ring. We have those already, okay, man? You don't need to describe it. Except those rules are created by the fathers, not by the people involved.
Yeah, and you're not engaging in baby-making behavior if you use contraception, birth control, things like that. You're just enjoying yourself. What he's saying is you'll stay celibate until you're going to get married. And that's the point here. Like, Bret would disagree with a parent-imposed or a church-imposed purity ring, but he wants people to iterate their way to the exact same conservative outcome as that, but following his own set of justifications that he believes are science-based, but ultimately the behavior and the outcome is exactly the same. So this is no different to those extreme religious movements. He just wouldn't see himself as religious and therefore wouldn't see himself as extreme here.
Right.
Let's wrap it up with that. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you very much. You're a beautiful person.
Okay, Marsh, what did you think of this second iteration we've listened to of Bret Weinstein?
So I think there is something good in here. I think there was something good. Bret mentions in this, when they're talking about evolution, there are some animals that haven't changed in a long time. People like things like crocodiles, alligators, stuff like that. And he says that isn't showing that they're worse than us because they haven't evolved or haven't changed in that time. It shows that maybe they just nailed it first time or nailed it a long time ago in their environment. I thought that was good. I think that's a good point. I think that's a point well made. It's a point that a lot of people misunderstand. They see some animals as not as evolved as us, but if those animals are well suited their environment, they're evolved as they need to be. If their genes are passing on and the animals aren't under threat, they've nailed it. So yeah, I thought that was pretty good. I'll give him some credit there.
Yeah, I'm not as dedicated as you as finding something good. I couldn't. I genuinely, like, there's like 45 minutes of this that is straight up incel shit. Like, it's straight up incel shit, and it's infuriating to listen to. Two guys who are nearing 60 or in their 60s, I don't know how old Bret is, but probably nearing 60, who are having boomer conversations about kids these days and how, you know, kids need to treat sex, et cetera, et cetera. And doing it in a way that's demeaning literally half the population that would be having that sex. It's gross and it's disgusting and it has, I mean, like, this is the most popular podcast and this is basically spouting a lot of incel culture stuff, and it's really kind of gross. All right, that's it for this week's show. Remember, you can access more than a half hour of bonus content each week for as little as $1 an episode by subscribing at patreon.com/NoRogan. And I will say, we put a lot of work in the show. So if you are someone who enjoys this show, if you think this show does good work, if you think this show picks apart some things that you think the audience needs to hear, and you think that's worth a couple bucks, we encourage you to go over to patreon.com/NoRogan. We put a lot of work in the show, and we hope that you will help support this endeavor. Meanwhile, you can hear more from me at Cognitive Dissonance and Citation Needed. You can hear more from Marsh at Skeptics with a K and the Skeptic podcast. And we're going to be back next week for a little more the No Rogan Experience. If you love the show, please rate and share it. If you want to get in touch with us, become a patron, or check out the show notes, go to norogan.com. KNOWROGAN.com.